Good morning and welcome to the rise of Fiscal Europe. Now, since the start of the Eurozone crisis, the powers that be have been trying to redesign and reconfigure financial oversight in Europe with new regulations, new reforms, and a new banking union. Pierre Schlosser is a Ph.D. researcher at the Department of Politics and Social Sciences here at the EUI, and Brigid Laffan is the director of the Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies. And together, they have penned a new report, The Rise of Fiscal Europe. The report aims to analyse the effectiveness of our new supervisory regime. So without too much further introduction, I'll hand over to Pierre, who will talk you through the presentation, and then I'll come back in 20 minutes with your questions and their answers. So enjoy the show. Pierre?
Thank you, Nick. Good morning, everyone. My name is Pierre Schlosser, and today, together with Brigid Laffan, I will walk you through the negotiation of Europe's new fiscal framework, which has been an extensive reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. Our presentation will be based on the report mentioned by Nick, but it would be also go beyond that to engage with the current policy debate and the long-term implications of the euro crisis on the EMU architecture. What we have in mind when we talk about the euro crisis is very much this idea of a European, maybe Northern European even, steamroller at work, fiscal discipline for all. And indeed that has been the story told during all this period, and ex post I think that we've considered everything through this lens. However, I'd like to invite you to question this simplistic view and bring in a bit more nuance, complexity, bringing back the density of the euro crisis by asking you a simple question. We will do a few of those polls during this webinar. So here is a question. I'm taking you by surprise, I'm aware of it. So in your view, what type of crisis did Europe struggle with over the last 5 years? Was it, can we say that it was a fiscal crisis? Can we say that it was a banking crisis? Or was it an institutional crisis? Or was it all of the above? So I will give you, this is a question, you have 4 possible answers. I open the poll right now, so you can make your choices in the box. It's getting interesting because we see a lot of weight on option 4, all of the above, which emerges as a consensus. So this is what I take from the results, is that basically a strong preference of participants is going for all of the above. That is to say that many factors have been at play. There hasn't been a single cause for the crisis. And what's pretty interesting is that among the answers, very few actually selected option 1, which is a fiscal crisis. And indeed, this is where I'm trying to bring you to is to say that the euro crisis has been much more and much different than a simple fiscal crisis. There have been many factors at play in the root causes, but also in the effects which have led to its play out. There has been an existential crisis, obviously, a lack of political commitment or some doubts on the political commitment over the euro. There's been unraveling protests which have with varying intensity during the crisis. There's been persisting market pressure, especially at the start. And there's been a slow crisis management. And this is it's basically this last aspect that has led to our puzzle in this paper, and the puzzle is relatively simple. We know today that the EU is quite famous for its incapacity to generate decisive agreement, even in the face of deep and pressing crises, and the recent very sudden refugee crisis is another illustration of this. Yet, what we've observed during the crisis is that there's been a substantial reform on the economic governance, and ways out of the joint decision trap have been formed. And the question then remains to see of which nature and magnitude these changes have been, and secondly, how one can explain these escape routes from institutional deadlock. So we'll proceed in 2 steps. First going into the six-pack and the two-pack, which has been quite substantial reform of the Stability and Growth Pact. And secondly, we're going to have a prospective look at the future scenarios for economic and monetary union, questioning the sustainability of the existing model. So in the following, I will guide you through the six and two pack. This will be based also on interviews which have been conducted in Brussels in autumn last year. And so that will allow to have the views of policymakers which have been interviewed in the European Parliament, in the Commission, but also in the Council, to support some of the findings we have brought forward. Let's go back to the context of the six-pack. So the six-pack was it started actually being discussed in March 2010, and that was a highly politicized context. The bad data on the fiscal deficits in Greece had been released actually in November, but then it took a bit of time for the crisis to kickstart. And what is often forgotten is that the six-pack was the first response to the crisis. It wasn't the bilateral loans to Greece, it wasn't the setup of financial firewalls that came later. And that explains actually why policymakers put a lot of emphasis on restoring the rules, on preventing future crises, because it was perceived that this would be the way to restore credibility, in particular in front of the financial markets. And the the six-pack has been negotiated, its agenda setting in particular has been set during the what is called the Task Force Van Rompuy, which has gathered several actors at the European level, the Commission, the Council, but it was under the chair of the European Council President. The process, therefore, was marked by a strong functional pressure to act. The agenda setting was captured by the European Council, again, strong role played by Van Rompuy over Barroso, who tried to fight back with two communications in May 2010, which came out to, again, try to recapture the political agenda, but it was too late. And a novel involvement also of the European Parliament. This marked really the process over the six-pack. And this is actually two developments, so the Task Force Van Rompuy and the Parliament involvement directly derives from the Lisbon Treaty. Because the Lisbon Treaty, which has been enforced just a few months before the start of the crisis, is foreseeing these two novelties. So what we're saying in the report is that this very much, to a large extent, pre-structured the pattern of crisis response. The outcome, some of you will know it reading the report or reading the press. It's been a lot of advances made in ensuring a stronger control over domestic policies. And indeed, the sanctions have been made stronger. The debt criterion, has been operationalized. The European semester has been created, and overall benchmarks monitoring have been improved to make sure that the expenditures, but also the debt, could be better held in check. So what we're calling the arsenal has been strengthened. And the Commission has now more levies to supervise national budgets. All of this happened in an interesting shadow cast by the Stability and Growth Pact. So there was no strong departure in the new framework of economic or fiscal policy coordination from the Maastricht idea and also from the Stability and Growth Pact. So there was a strong path dependent. And what we've observed is a movement of layering of new rules over the former, which is also leading to some complexity, but we will go back to this in a few slides. So some illustrative evidence. Non-compliance with rules was identified as the cause of the crisis, not the good or bad performance of economies. This is something which is coming from a quote from someone in the European Parliament. We try to defend the system and improve it. Very strong commitment to the previous type of rules-based economic coordination. We defend the system. So basically we discount alternatives by the same token. This new framework had to be created in a rush. This is obviously what's happening. I take note of this task force, but I will make proposals independent. This is where we come back to basically this power game between the European Commission on the other hand and the European Council presidents. And then the involvement of the Parliament also brought to bear some new tensions, in particular when it came onto the European semester, which originally was a Commission ID. But what happened is that in the end, the Commission was lukewarm to push it forward in the sense that it saw that the Council was quite opposed to the idea, and it was the Parliament which pushed it forward. And the Parliament was also quite intrigued by the attitude of the Commission, and the reason they're bringing forward is to say that the ECFIN in particular, so the Commission Directorate for Economic and Financial Affairs, wasn't used to co-decision. It was the first time with the Lisbon Treaty that this happened. The case of the two-pack is also very much interesting because the context has been really different. The discussions have started in November 2011, so context is very much less politicized. We've had some reform fatigue because if you remember well, 2011 was characterized by many discussions over all possible financial firewalls, ECB interventions, etc. And the scope of the two-pack also explains lower attention. It was more technical and long-term in nature. So the process was a bit more classic in the sense that the community method was the spirit of the community method was more respected. The Commission was in the lead, as we will see in some of the quotes. The European Council was, despite being involved obviously in reviewing the strategic content of it, was not really interested. I mean, it didn't. The text passed at the Council within 3 months, so that's a good example. A good illustration of how it went fast. And the EP was less influential. They were more trapped in partisan politics over Eurobonds, solidaristic perspectives. And that didn't help actually in getting their provisions across. Also, the success of the two-pack can be explained by this new euro area legal basis, which is also given by the Lisbon Treaty. The outcome is a clear budgetary hierarchy between the centre and member states. Why? Because with the two-pack, we have now a common timeline on the elaboration of draft budgets. So basically, starting on the 15th of April every year, there will be budgetary plans which have to be, it's called medium-term fiscal plans. And then on the 15th of October, member states should publish their draft budgets. And following this moment, the Commission can then analyze them and express whether they're in severe or in non-compliance with the provisions of the Stability and Growth Pact. So this is a quite intrusive way to reinforce the power of the Commission over national budgets. There were other aspects, we have not so much time, so I will not dive into this, but there are also other aspects in terms of more stringent reporting requirements for euro area under countries, which includes, for example, audits, which could be activated over very comprehensive audits at member state level. Some illustrative evidence also is there. So everyone in the EP had an opinion on the six-pack. It wasn't the case for the two-pack, which shows the lower salience and less politicking on the pact altogether. The pressure to do a bit more came from inside the Commission, based also on some frustration over how the program assistance to southern countries in program were conducted, where basically was a lot of Eurogroup involved. And so they wanted to do a bit more community method, and the Commission took the chance. Someone is a bit more blunt and says the two-pack, it was the Commission, it was their idea. And some concerns also were voiced during the interviews where some people were saying we're using the existing coordination provision of the treaty to their full potential, having some doubts on the wider legitimacy implications of this phenomenon. So rounding up, we can see that the economic governance has resulted in an across-the-board reform of Europe's fiscal surveillance framework, but there were also unintended consequences attached. One is the complexity. It's getting increasingly difficult to determine whether a country, a member state, is respecting the provisions of the original Stability and Growth Pact, because there is a lot of discretion in its assessment. There are a lot of factors which can attenuate the fault of a member state. And in all this, economic indicators play a key role, such as the output gap, notably. And there is an enhanced discretion by the Commission, leading some member states to declare last year that it's becoming really a black box how to assess member states' budgets. So we're ending up with the regime of rules, but also discretion. And what we're arguing is that the current hybrid regime is basically unsustainable. So we could hypothesize a switch from the current model, which is decentralized fiscal policies under EU rules, towards an EMU finance minister paradigm. That could be a way forward. But what we're also seeing is that alternative to muddling through are politically costly. In other words, and to use a quote from a recent Brookings paper by Zingeles and others, there's no desire to go backward, no interest in going forward, but it is economically unsustainable to stay still. Without further ado, I will hand over to Brigid, who will elaborate further on these notions and try to bring some sense to these complex constructs.
Good morning, everyone. What I would like to do now is talk about some scenarios for the future of this system. And of course, with a scenario, scenarios help clarify, illustrate, but also simplify. So what you're about to see now is a classical 2x2 matrix, at least if I was going in the right direction, would be. And I distinguish between here less Europe and more Europe, adaptation and transformation. And this translates into muddling through, which we argue is where the system now is, disintegration, and there are disintegrative tendencies in the EU and perhaps in the long term in the euro area. The Holy Grail would be a United States of Europe. That is a fully integrated polity. We don't think that's an available future. So essentially the politics, the real meat of what will happen over the next 10 years is the tension between continuing muddling through and what we call here go ham or go home. Go ham is a reference to Andrew Hamilton, to the fact that in the end, that most mature currency zones have certain institutional and policy regimes. And so this is the key battle, and the question is, where do we lie in terms of the forces for that battle? Will we see a future of Hamilton, Spinelli, Nigel Farage, or Merkel? So let's look at where the dynamic is just now. But before we do, we have a poll, and that poll asks a very simple question. The question is it necessary to have greater political integration in order to have an economically and politically sustainable euro? It's a binary choice, yes or no. Well, I think that's a pretty clear impact, in that the vast majority think that there needs to be a more politically integrated system within the Eurozone. Of course, how to achieve that and how to arrive at that is the tricky bit. But I think that there is certainly a consensus, both academic and in terms of observers, that there needs to be more in the Eurozone. So moving beyond the poll then, what is beyond muddling through? Well, in the system, we have the report of the 5 presidents, and that report is the latest effort to establish what a Eurozone beyond muddling through would look like, building on the Van Rompuy. You can't see me? Excuse me, apparently I can't be seen.
No, we can see you, Brigid. We can.
Pierre, so I can be seen. Okay,
Yes.
well, moving on, apologies for this. Moving on to the report of the 5 presidents, that builds on the report of the 4 presidents, the Van Rompuy report, and essentially the main unions involved in the next phase of the Eurozone continue into this report. A genuine economic union, a financial union, fiscal union, and political union. But interestingly, a very important sentence at the beginning of the report of the 5 presidents is that the euro is more than a currency, it is a political and economic project. And of course it is filling in the politics and the economics that is now at the heart. So why the report of the 5 presidents? This is very classical EU governance. It's an attempt by the supranational institutions, together with the president of the Eurogroup, to set the agenda, to establish a roadmap, and to establish a calendar. And that's very classical in the history of integration, that you aim using calendars, using agenda setting, establishing roadmaps to transform, but transform in an incremental way. So let's look at the report of the 5 presidents at this roadmap. So I'm going to fill in the whole. So the roadmap involves 2 phases. Phase 1, July 15 to June 17. That's the short phase, that's the immediate. And here it's essentially more of the same, deepening by doing. So strengthening what has already been achieved. But then beginning in 2017, there's an attempt to move the system decisively in the direction of deepening. And that transition from phase 1 to phase 2, they don't actually establish a clear roadmap, because they say that there will be a Commission white paper in spring of 2017. So essentially what this is saying is that by spring 2017, there will be another attempt at agenda setting and becoming much more specific on some of the details. But I would argue that the essential trade-offs are already contained in this document, and we look at what those are. So firstly, economic union. Here it's more of the same. Strengthening the European semester, all that Pierre spoke about in terms of the rules. Interestingly, on the imbalance procedure, there is a hint at least that the question of surpluses and not just deficits needs to be taken into account, and that's important. That's a really sensitive issue, of course, for Germany. And the big institutional, although it's not big, the institutional innovation is a system of competitiveness authorities. Here the emphasis is on structural reform and the overall macroeconomic balances within the Union. More of the same, with some institution building and some shift in terms of focus. Financial union. I think since the euro crisis, the attempt to bring the euro crisis into control has really involved more integration in this field than in any other. Banking union has moved much further than any of the other unions we're talking about. Here, it's the next big initiative is the European Deposit Insurance Scheme and the need for a credible backstop. But there is a lot of momentum behind banking union. Of course, it involves private risk sharing, which is politically much more palatable than public risk sharing. Fiscal union. Here is the heart of the trade-off in the system as we now speak. Essentially, what is being argued is that if there's more responsible budgetary policies, more convergence, sustained convergence, more legal rules, so in other words, six-pack, pact and all the other pacts, that if this becomes embedded and stable, then the goal then would be to establish a fiscal stabilization capacity. And as we know, most mature currency unions have a fiscal stabilization capacity. Interestingly, it argues that transfers should never be permanent and never in one direction. In other words, the EU will not become a system of, or Euro will not become a system of permanent interregional transfers, but fiscal stabilization is the big trade-off. The fourth union, and by far the most problematic, and in the sense of the report of the 5 presidents, the most underdeveloped. There is an argument, again, we all agree, of the need for greater accountability and legitimacy if the Eurozone is to become sustainable. They talk of institutional strengthening. That institutional strengthening focuses very much on the role of the European Parliament and national parliaments. That's a continuing debate in integration and has been for a long time. External representation of the euro. But the big institutional innovation here is the establishment of a euro area treasury. Now, what does that mean? It's very underspecified in the report of the presidents. Does this mean that you have a treasury with fiscal resources? Does it mean that you have a European finance minister? What does this mean for government in the euro area and in the Eurozone? So this is underspecified, but is in institutional terms certainly the big new idea. Now, those are the 4 unions. Why is political union so undercooked in the report? It's undercooked because political union is very difficult to define. There can be many institutional configurations, but also you don't get a political union without politics. And what we don't know is what will happen multi-level politics over the next 10 years. So far and to date, domestic democratic politics trumps all other politics in Europe in terms of legitimacy, systems of accountability, salience and attention from voters. But will there be a slow change? We see already the Europeanization of national elections. We see the impact of a Greek election on the rest of Europe. So what will happen in the politics basket? And that is really where the interesting, from a political science point of view, the interesting questions are, how do we match multi-level governance with multi-level politics in a way that is regarded as accountable and legitimate? And there is another question, and that is, can you have a greatly reinforced Eurozone governance without the consent of the people? So we're left with those old conundrums and tensions of European integration. We will see more centralized economic governance in the Eurozone. We continue to have divided accountability, and we have nested and connected politics. And we still don't know how those nested and connected politics will work through over the next 10 years. We can think of all sorts of institutional fixes, but you can't have a political union without European politics. So to sum up, where the battle is between muddling through and go ham and go home, which is a shorthand for functional federalism. We will see more functional federalism. How the institutional edifice will work through, but much more importantly, how the politics will play out, is one of the big questions of European integration and the Eurozone over the next period. So one last poll, and that is, which of these scenarios would you support? Muddling through, go ham or go home, or the disintegration of the Eurozone? So there are those who support a continuing muddling through, which is a very EU way of approaching things. The majority thinks that we need to move to a higher level, or a deeper level, I should say, rather than higher. And of course, there are those who think that the Eurozone, as is an unsustainable currency, and we know historically that currencies without states do not have a very good record. So thank you very much, and we're very open to your questions, and thank you for engaging with us.
So if you hadn't had a chance to read the research report here, it is available on the Florence School of Banking and Finance website. It's in the publications section. It's not right at the top. You have to scroll down a little bit, but there is a link if you scroll up a bit here in the chat. Now we're ready to take your questions. So if you put your questions in the Q&A box just below there, I'll start us off. Brigid, we seem to have a mandate here in the webinar for go ham and go home, but how do you get a mandate for that across Europe, and is there any historical precedent for such a mandate that you can think of?
That's a very good question. I think that you firstly have got to get a mandate from national governments, the Eurozone governments and their parliaments. And that's not, there would still be very significant divergence of preferences among the Euro member states as it is. But I think this is of such order and so important that it also requires engagement with Europe's peoples. On the one hand, the majority of citizens in Eurozone countries are committed to the euro and want it as their currency. And therefore, there has to be engagement with them on what is required to make that currency a currency for all that works for all, both the creditors and debtors, both the better performing economies and the worst.
Okay, so we do have questions coming in now in the Q&A box. The first one is, what role will non-Euro area states play in possible reform of the treaties? Will they make more reform more difficult? I suppose that's a question about interruption from David Cameron.
Again, I think this is a very important question, and I felt that the report of the 5 presidents should have paid more attention, because they effectively pay none, to relations between the ins and outs in the Eurozone. And in the end, if this requires treaty reform, and I suspect when the Commission publishes its report in spring 2017, they will indicate the need for treaty reform, then I think the balance between Euro and non-Euro is very important.
Okay, so we have a question from...
To add on that...
Oh, go ahead.
If I may. I think that it's for sure not so sustainable in the current architecture to have, as a report advocates, the 5 presidents report, to deepen the Eurogroup, because there is really a tension in the counterpart of the Eurogroup for EU 27 in 28 countries, which is the ECOFIN, which meets the day after, and basically they have the same discussions. So it's a bit hypocritical to sustain that, you know, we can just go on and ignore that the Eurogroup is getting stronger. At the same time, its institutionalization will pose major challenges. If you make an analogy with secondary legislation, as we did on the 2-pack, you could say that actually the fact that there is a new secondary possibility for member states of the Euro area to adopt their own legislation, which won't affect the UK, won't affect Poland, won't affect everyone which is outside of the Euro, that this could help to give some more leeway and ensure that there is less blocking power from the non-Euro area member states. I have plenty of questions.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the dramatic summer we had with Greece. Antonio's asking, considering the June-July crisis and the lack of trust in politics, is there really any chance of a political union anytime soon?
Well, I think that the euro is like a patient who's had a bad, very bad accident. Everything hurts. They're now out of life support, but in rehabilitation. And I think it will require a lot of rehabilitation before trust is re-established. And of course, and I don't want to focus too much on Greece, this really is a time for quiet about Greece, that hopefully Greece can manage domestically to structural reform, and that its economy gets some oxygen, because without this, Greece's long-term membership of the euro will come into question again.
Pierre?
Yeah, just to add on that and say that basically the five presidents report published in June, which is actually a good summary of the current preferences of member states, is indicated that there will not be any political union anytime in the foreseeable future. So basically what they're saying is that nothing will happen before 2017, because in spring there will be a white paper from the Commission that's going to take a few months. And strangely enough, it leads you to autumn 2017, which is after both the French and the German elections, if I'm not mistaken. So you kick down the can further down the road. And the idea there is to make sure that you have a first phase of where everyone does its homework. The convergence process can only be summarized in those terms. Everyone does the reforms, the structural reforms, etc. So the mantra hasn't really changed, and I think that the political union debate is really conditioned on whatever happens in terms of the economic union. Maybe there will be a plus on the fiscal union side, the stabilization function that Brigid has mentioned, but moving towards a political union, especially in a team of 28 member states or 18, is going to be, I think, difficult to have this big leap forward.
Okay, so here's a very technical question. Considering the unanimity requirements of Article 48 and the increasing number of critical constituencies and a number of member states, do you think that formal reforms of the treaty are feasible at all?
Macro treaty change is extremely difficult in the present political climate, but the Union has achieved it in the past in very difficult circumstances. But I think also I would look to the fiscal compact and what happened. In other words, that if treaty change
Yeah, and plus we forget that the treaty has been changed during the crisis. I mean, the article relating to the no bailout clause has been complemented by a possibility to introduce the European Stability Mechanism. So it has been modified. We can ask why this occasion hasn't been used to modify other things. Once you open the treaty, you should maybe do more than one change. Nick, we can't hear you anymore.
Macro.
Hello, I'm here again. Sorry, having some problems with my microphone there. But we have more questions coming in. We have independent fiscal institutions in several countries, but not a proper independent Eurozone, or EU. Independent fiscal authority and simply the current institutional complexity as the ECB has done with monetary policy. Don't you think?
Yeah, I can take this one. I think that we're too much thinking in terms of replicating the model of monetary policy towards fiscal policy. And I think that there are risks, democratic risks in doing so. Because what has happened on monetary policy was basically to say, because of inflation concerns and no credibility to have it run by a political authority, monetary policy should be conducted by an independent council or agency, which in the case of the EU is the ECB. Fine. On the fiscal side, however, if we do the same, as has been conducted also to some extent during the reforms of the fiscal compact, and also the two-pack, which empowers fiscal councils at the independent fiscal councils at the national level. Well, you just reduce the scope for politics, and you ensure that rules and regulatory agencies are basically run by experts or dictating all the terms of the domestic debates. And I think this could be dangerous, and that's why I'm a bit concerned by one of the recommendations of the Five Presidents report, which mentions that basically there should be at the EU level a fiscal board, a fiscal policy board, which would be made up of experts, and that could be to some extent the ECB counterpart that you're mentioning. But then the question is, will they look at the aggregate fiscal stance and make recommendations on this? This could be welcome because it would have a less individualistic, less country-specific focus on fiscal policy, which I think is a caveat. Or is it just used to dictate fiscal discipline altogether? It's at this stage still unknown.
Yeah, actually, we have a question about that precisely, suggesting that if we have more integration economically and we have something resembling a European finance minister, would that mean that we would have to have common employment and social policies across the European Union?
I think given the divergence in levels of development, but also in domestic preferences and histories of labour market law and welfare systems, I think we will continue to have a relatively decentralised system in those fields.
Is something like a more equal welfare state across the European Union, is that something we should be aiming for in the long term, perhaps looking a few decades ahead? Or is that something we shouldn't really be thinking about?
I think the diversity, the divergence of preferences over this is really huge. And so I would think that it should be kept decentralized.
I only ask because I think the job of... Sorry, go ahead.
But what one could see are minimum standards established across Europe. So a platform rather than at the upper end.
Yes, that idea was suggested at the State of the Union here back in May. I only really asked because I suppose the job of a finance minister in most countries isn't just to look after the banks and keep economic stability, but it's also to redistribute the gains of such things. Would that be expected if we had a political position like that with a democratic mandate?
I don't think that the EU is not a scaled up version of the nation state. And therefore, any redistribution within the EU will be much more limited, much more constrained, both in time and intention, than the acceptance at national level of a social contract. So I don't see permanent interregional transfers or permanent interpersonal transfers within the EU. It is a different kind of polity. It's not a scaled up version of the nation state.
Okay, here's another question for you, Brigid. What do you mean by functional federalism in the go home or go ham scenario? Does it include the main ideas of Hamilton, e.g., mutualization or assumptions of states' debts and EU tax and borrowing power, EU fiscal capacity with its own resources? Do you think it's feasible in the next 5 years?
Very easy to answer that. No, it's not. And when we were using ham, it was more a shorthand term for more than what the Eurozone has now, rather than the fully fledged apparatus that was built in the United States over 150 years. I do think that there will be, on a 10-year cycle, a stabilization mechanism. I think there will have to be some Eurozone level fiscal capacity. But I don't see it unemployment insurance or all that goes with interstate transfers in the United States. It will be different. And by functional federalism, I meant that instead of a cohesive integrative polity, it looks more like different unions with varying levels of depth and institutional configuration.
Yeah.
There seemed to be a change in France and Germany's approach towards a common fiscal capacity, as they outlined also in their common report. So maybe things could change there. Mario Monti is currently chairing a group of reflection on this, so you should come forward with a report, I think, at the end of this year or early next year. So the idea has been there. The problem is that the idea has been there for over decades, so it's not new and expectations are very low. But Schäuble, before the summer, the German finance minister, has also opened up to that possibility, but there are also strings attached.
Okay, I am being told that we had a very good question from somebody called Alfredo de Fio, but it's vanished from the screens in front of us. So if you're still here, Alfredo, please retype it in somewhere, and hopefully I'll see it and I'll be able to ask it. I suppose I only ask about the redistribution thing because what I've been hearing in English politics a lot recently is that policies like welfare, they're only popular if they seem to be working for everybody. So things that are only perceived to be working for the working class become unpopular with the middle class, and so on and so forth. So if we want to secure mandates for a more integrated European Union, financially and economically, wouldn't that have to be seen to be doing more than banking stability and so on?
But the whole idea of a fiscal stabilization mechanism would be to help smooth out the business cycle and help countries in trouble. Again, I think the analogy of national welfare systems is not a good one, because it took an extraordinary social compact and political configuration to deliver domestic welfare systems. And I don't think that's available at a European level. And of course, at the national level, welfare systems are under pressure because of both, on the one hand, rising expectations, and on the other, pressure on public finances. But you're right in the essential point that welfare systems are accepted by citizens, provided that there is redistribution, but redistribution to everyone. And that's why, say, national education systems, etc., are usually do benefit more the middle classes.
Yeah, to add on
but this is not an available option in Europe.
I think we should be clear about what the public good it is we are expecting from the EU level. And I would think that there is a confusion there that basically the EU should deliver stability, growth, social cohesion, etc. And I think if you look at the euro crisis, there's no consensus, in my view at least, to go beyond simply providing stability for all. And that's where a stabilization capacity could help, but it's not going to be redistributive. And this is where the two levels ought to be strictly separated.
So the question, we have managed to find it again, was regarding the the relation between the five presidents report and the Franco-German initiative. What is the foreseeable timeline for this?
I must say I don't recall that there was a strict timeline in the French-German initiative. But just to say a few words on the French-German initiative is that it's been made basically by the two economics ministers, who usually have different ideas about the next steps over EMU. And in other words, Sigmar Gabriel from the German Social Democrats have a different opinion, as we know, than Wolfgang Schäuble, who is the finance minister. So I think that despite the clear view and the ambition that you can find into this French-German initiative, it's not Hollande and Merkel sitting together and committing to something. It's basically two ministers who have some ideas, and that's how we should take it. The five presidents report, in my view, sets the roadmap, and the recent declarations of Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, on the idea of having a deposit guarantee scheme to complement the banking union, and saying that it's not going to happen in the near future, calls for caution, I think, in all this debate.
Okay, well, we've been going for about an hour now, so I think I'm going to conclude here by thanking our guests, Pierre Schlosser and Brigid Laffan, and thank everybody else who took part, who watched, who asked questions, who took part in the polls, and thank you to Matt, who made so much effort putting this all together on the technology front. The report is available on the FBF website in the publications section. Scroll down, it is The Rise of Fiscal Europe, Negotiating Europe's New Economic Governance. It is interesting. Thank you all again. Hopefully we'll be doing something like this again very soon, so do pay attention when you get an email from the Florence School of Banking and Finance. Goodbye.
Thank you.